Morning, everybody. Yeah, we drew straws as to who got to follow Jaziri. Listen, we're already behind, so I'm going to try and speed this up. But the conversation today is about who this city is for and who gets to participate in it and who gets to share the upside of the amazing change that we're beginning to feel. So I want to actually try and put you in that space to think about it for a moment. And I want to start by talking to the white people in the room. I'd like you to think for a moment about my friend Janera Solomon, who shared with me over coffee the other day about how this woman who has helped bring East Liberty back to life through the power of art was walking through a store in East Liberty the other day and was followed because she's a black woman shopping in a high-end store. I'd like you to think about the Reverend who came to visit me in my office the other day, and he looked like $1 million because he always looks like $1 million. He dresses better than most people I know, and he shared the story of coming into our building, 625 Liberty Avenue, stopping at the stoplight right outside the building, and a car pulled up to the red light while he was waiting for the crosswalk sign, and the woman inside the car reached over and locked the door because she saw him. I'd like you to think about Shirley Malcolm, who's a member of our board, who recounted to me just a couple of days ago her experience coming home from one of our meetings last week, driving from Pittsburgh to D.C. and being pulled over by a police officer and panicking as she reached to make sure that she had her registration and her license in her hand when the officer came to her window, so that she wouldn't have to reach. Every one of you knows stories like this. We know the more severe stories. We know the ones that make the national news. The Chinese in the year 900 invented a form of torture called death by 1,000 cuts, which way before Game of Thrones, by the way, was the torture of lopping off bits of a person until they died. And these countless small stories tell us a story of suffering that is difficult for us to fathom. But I'd like the white people in the room to do me a favor. If you would be okay being treated this way, if you would be okay having your children treated this way, we're going to do a ripoff here of Jane Elliott, an anti-racist advocate who is amazing at this. My apologies to her. But if you would be okay with that, I want you to stand. I want you to stand if you would want yourself and your family to be treated in that way. Interesting. So let's talk to the men for a moment about what it's like to operate in this society as a woman. And I want you to think for a moment about all of the women in your life and the stories they have told you about having their career options decided by what men tell them they're good at, by the stories that they've told you about the unwanted approaches, the unwanted words, the unwanted neglect, the unwanted ignoring in meetings. I want you to think for a moment about the national political dialogue and having people joke about taking away your suffrage. How many of the men in this room would be okay with being treated the way women in our community and society are? Stand if you want to sign up for that. Yeah, that's for me. No one. I want to talk to the straight people in the room for a moment, the folks who are not members of the LGBT community, and I want you to think for a moment about a national political scene in which people are actively on the state, local, and national level trying to take away not just your right to marry, but your marriage. Who are trying to legislate what bathrooms you can use, where you are acceptable, what about you is actually legitimately human. Who here would like to sign up to be treated the way that the LGBT community so often is in our community and in the country? Sorry, I have to do this because I can't really see you. But I don't really need to in order to know that you aren't standing. I want you to think for a moment, if you're not currently disabled in any way, you're not suffering from any sort of disability, about what it's like to have to navigate every day the barriers that life has brought you because of issues around mobility or sight or hearing or any other number of challenges that you may face. And on top of that, you have to deal with people telling you what you're capable of, what you're good at, and even now put up with mockery on the national stage. How many of us want to sign up for that? Any of you? Finally, we could play this game all day, but let's think for a moment about the people who are kind of top of mind in our community, in our country right now, people who are from somewhere else, people who are immigrants, people who are seen as different for whatever the reason may be. And here I'm thinking about my friends, my family, people who all of you know, who because their skin is a different color are told, go back to your own country. I'm thinking about Las Palmas, the Mexican grocer, and the graffiti and vandalism of their shop. I'm thinking about the 1,000 slights that immigrants in our community and people who are perceived as outsiders in some way, shape, or form are treated to every day. How many of you in this room want to sign up for that? So the point is, folks, this is what privilege looks like. This right here. The fact is that for nothing to change, all we have to do is nothing. All we have to do is exactly what we're doing right now, which is to continue sitting, and we'll create that kind of community for the next generation. It's hard to do something. You know, you look at the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in Ferguson and Baltimore. People get angry about that because those protests are scary. All right, fine. So Black Lives Matter articulates an agenda and they organize, and people get mad at that because that's scary. And then Colin Kaepernick decides to kneel. That's peaceful, right? It should be okay. But then, no, that's scary. We will always be told that trying to change something is scary. That's precisely the task that lies before us if we are going to be serious about creating an inclusive and genuinely all-in Pittsburgh, a genuinely just community. The other day I had the opportunity to sit with a rapper named Piper who performs with a band called Flipside on the West Coast. He goes now by the name Jay Ferreira, which is his actual given name. And he is a cop as well as a performing artist. And I asked him what it's like to be a Black Lives Matter activist and a cop at the same time. And he said, look, this is what I tell people whenever they ask me about Black Lives Matter. If you look at the history in this country, every time black folks have stood up for their rights, everybody in the culture has benefited. There are a lot of people wearing the uniform today, he told me, who wouldn't be wearing the uniform if there hadn't been the civil rights movement, and that's not just black people. And I would submit that the same is true of every movement that we've seen, the women's rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, to bring greater dignity and inclusion to our culture. We all benefit. It's sometimes hard to wrap our minds around. At the risk of quoting another old white man, I want to quote the Pope for a moment from his latest encyclical, the Laudato Si. An amazing piece of work if you haven't read it. But one of the things he says in there is, we are one single human family. There are no frontiers or barriers, political or social, behind which we can hide. Still less is there room for the globalization of indifference. All of you are the most important people at this conference today because this is about how we take on not just the globalization of indifference, but the localization of indifference. So to get this conference started, I'd like you all to stand for a moment if you're able. This is the interactive part. Please stand. You know, here's the truth that we all together have to hold on to. We're living in a magical time in this community. For the first time in a generation, things are changing and moving. And yes, that's scary, and yes, it brings up challenges, and yes, it can make us angry at times, and yes, there is racism and venomous hatred afoot in the country. But we, all around this room, get to be the generation that decides which side wins. We, in this generation in Pittsburgh, get to decide the type of community we create, and whether it looks like the video that Andre shared, or whether it looks more like the folks in this room. And I think I know where the folks in this room want to go. So here's the charge for today. This is not about being entertained. This is about engaging in the ideas. Hopefully, we've put together a group of speakers who will challenge you and inform you. And the speakers, by the way, will include both national and local speakers, because that's part of the feedback that we got last time, that we'd like to see more of the local genius as well as the national genius. So listen to that, but then participate in the conversations, because here's the goal. What we want is that at some point down the road, when a similar set of questions is asked about would you stand in the shoes of another, this is what you would see. Thank you.